Encoding through focused attention is the entry point for all effective learning because the brain does not store everything it encounters. It selectively strengthens what it pays attention to. At any given moment, your brain is receiving far more information than it can process, and attention acts as a filter that determines which signals are important enough to be encoded into memory. When you deliberately focus on a specific task or concept, you activate neural circuits associated with that information, and this repeated activation is what leads to long-term change. This process is driven by neuromodulators such as acetylcholine and norepinephrine, which are released when you engage in focused attention. These chemicals increase the signal-to-noise ratio in the brain, meaning the relevant information becomes more prominent while irrelevant input is suppressed. As a result, the circuits involved in what you are studying fire more strongly and more consistently, making them more likely to be reinforced. Without this neurochemical support, the brain treats incoming information as low priority and does not invest the resources needed to store it effectively. Distraction directly interferes with this mechanism. When you switch your attention between tasks, even briefly, you disrupt the continuous activation of the neural circuits you are trying to strengthen. Each time your focus shifts, the brain has to reallocate resources, which weakens the overall encoding process. This is why multitasking or even having background distractions like notifications or open tabs significantly reduces learning efficiency. The brain is not designed to deeply encode multiple streams of information at once. It performs best when attention is concentrated on a single target. Sustained attention also has a time-dependent component. It takes several minutes for the brain to transition from a scattered state into one of deep focus. During this period, neural activity becomes more synchronized, and the relevant circuits begin to dominate. If you interrupt this process too early, you never reach the level of intensity required for strong encoding. This is why uninterrupted blocks of focused work are far more effective than fragmented study sessions spread across constant distractions. Another important aspect is intentionality. Simply looking at material is not the same as actively focusing on it. When you approach a study session with a clear objective, such as understanding a concept, solving a specific problem, or being able to explain something in your own words, you guide your attention in a more structured way. This increases the likelihood that the brain will encode the information because it is being processed with purpose rather than passively observed. Over time, practicing focused attention strengthens your ability to concentrate for longer periods. The brain adapts to repeated demands, so consistently engaging in distraction-free study trains your system to enter that state more easily. This creates a compounding effect where each session becomes more efficient and the amount of information you can encode increases. Learning is driven by retrieval, not exposure, because the brain strengthens information when it is actively reconstructed, not when it is passively received. When you read, watch, or listen to material, it can feel like you understand it, but that sense of familiarity is often misleading. The brain has recognized the information, but recognition is not the same as recall. True learning occurs when you can access that information without cues, and that requires engaging the neural circuits responsible for retrieval. When you attempt to recall something from memory, the brain is forced to reactivate the specific pathways associated with that information. This reactivation strengthens the connections between neurons, making future retrieval faster and more reliable. Each time you successfully recall a concept, you are essentially reinforcing the pathway that leads to it. Even unsuccessful attempts are valuable because they highlight gaps in understanding and generate error signals that guide further learning. This process is often referred to as active recall, and it is one of the most effective ways to study. Instead of repeatedly reviewing notes or rereading a textbook, you challenge yourself to retrieve the information without looking at the source. This might involve answering questions, summarizing material from memory, or explaining a concept as if you were teaching it to someone else. These activities force the brain to do the work of reconstruction, which is exactly what strengthens memory. There is also an important role for difficulty in this process. When retrieval requires effort, the learning effect is stronger. If something is too easy to recall, the brain does not need to engage deeply, and the benefit is smaller. If it is too difficult and you cannot retrieve anything at all, the process becomes less effective. The optimal zone is where retrieval is challenging, but still achievable. This level of difficulty creates strong neural activation and leads to more durable learning. Error signals are closely tied to retrieval. When you attempt to recall information and make a mistake, the brain detects a mismatch between what you expected and what is correct. This mismatch generates a signal that drives plasticity, allowing the brain to adjust and improve. If you immediately check the correct answer after an error, you provide the brain with the information it needs to update the pathway. Over time, this cycle of attempt, error, and correction leads to more accurate and stable knowledge. Another advantage of retrieval-based learning is that it improves not only memory, but also the ability to apply knowledge in different contexts. Because you are reconstructing information rather than simply recognizing it, the brain builds more flexible representations. This makes it easier to use what you have learned in new situations, which is a key aspect of true understanding. As this method is repeated, the brain becomes more efficient at accessing stored information. Retrieval becomes faster and requires less effort, which frees up cognitive resources for higher-level thinking. This is how knowledge becomes usable, not just stored, and why retrieval is a central mechanism for effective learning. Error signals are a fundamental driver of learning because they provide the brain with the exact information it needs to adjust and improve performance. When you attempt to do something, solve a problem, recall information, or apply a concept, the brain generates an expectation of what the correct outcome should be. If the actual result does not match that expectation, a mismatch occurs. This mismatch creates what is known as an error signal, which is one of the most powerful triggers for neuroplasticity. The brain is constantly trying to minimize these errors over time. It uses them as feedback to refine its internal models of how things work. Without error signals, the brain has no clear indication that change is needed. This is why staying in a comfort zone, where tasks are easy and outcomes are predictable, leads to very little improvement. In those situations, performance may feel smooth, but the underlying neural circuits are not being challenged or updated. When you engage in tasks that are slightly beyond your current ability, you naturally generate more errors. This can feel uncomfortable, but that discomfort is directly tied to the learning process. The brain responds to these mismatches by increasing the release of neuromodulators like dopamine and norepinephrine, which enhance attention and promote the strengthening of relevant neural pathways. These chemicals help mark the experience as important and worth learning from. There's an optimal level of difficulty for generating effective error signals. If a task is too easy, errors are minimal, and learning slows down. If it is too difficult and errors are overwhelming, the brain may struggle to extract useful information, and motivation can decrease. The ideal condition is where you are making mistakes, but still able to understand and correct them. This balance ensures that error signals are frequent and meaningful without becoming discouraging. The timing of feedback also matters. When you make an error, the brain is in a state where it is actively seeking correction. Providing the correct information shortly after the mistake allows the brain to update the relevant circuits while they are still active. This strengthens the connection between the correct response and the situation in which it should be applied. Delayed or absent feedback reduces the effectiveness of this process because the neural activity associated with the error has already faded. Another important aspect is how you interpret errors. If mistakes are viewed as failure, the brain may shift into a defensive state, reducing engagement and increasing avoidance. If they are viewed as informative signals, the brain remains in a learning mode, more willing to engage with challenging material. This interpretation influences whether you continue to expose yourself to situations that generate useful error signals. Over time, consistently working in this error-driven way refines your skills and knowledge more efficiently. The brain becomes better at detecting mismatches, adjusting responses, and improving accuracy. What initially required conscious effort and frequent correction becomes more automatic as the neural circuits are strengthened and optimized. Short, intense study bouts are more effective than long, unfocused sessions because they align with how the brain naturally cycles through states of attention and fatigue. The brain is not designed to maintain high levels of focus indefinitely. Instead, it operates in periods where attention can be sustained at a high level for a limited time, after which performance begins to decline. Working within these natural windows allows you to maximize the quality of learning rather than simply increasing the quantity of time spent. When you begin a study session, there's usually a transition period where your brain shifts from a distracted state into a more focused one. During this time, neural activity becomes more organized, and the circuits related to the task start to dominate. As you continue to concentrate, neuromodulators like acetylcholine and norepinephrine increase, enhancing your ability to process and encode information. This is the phase where learning is most efficient because your attention is fully engaged and the brain is primed for plasticity. However, this state cannot be maintained indefinitely. After a certain period, often around 60 to 90 minutes, mental fatigue begins to set in. The levels of these neuromodulators decrease, and the brain's ability to sustain attention declines. Continuing to work beyond this point without a break leads to diminishing returns. You may still be putting in time, but the quality of learning drops significantly because the brain is no longer in an optimal state for encoding information. Short, intense sessions take advantage of the peak period of focus while avoiding the decline that follows. By working in concentrated blocks, you ensure that most of your effort occurs when your brain is most capable of learning. This approach also makes it easier to maintain high levels of engagement because the task feels more manageable within a defined time frame. Knowing that a break is coming reduces mental resistance and helps you stay fully committed during the session. Breaks between sessions are not just for rest, they are part of the learning process. When you step away from focused work, the brain begins to process and consolidate what you have just studied. This can happen during simple activities like walking or resting, where the mind is not actively engaged in new input. These periods allow neural circuits to stabilize and strengthen without additional strain. Another advantage of shorter sessions is that they encourage consistency. It is easier to commit to a focused block of time each day than to sustain long, exhausting study periods. Consistency leads to repeated activation of the same neural circuits, which is essential for long-term learning. Over time, these repeated sessions build stronger and more reliable knowledge. The key is intensity during the session. A short period of deep focus, where distractions are minimized and attention is fully directed at the task, produces far greater results than hours of fragmented effort. By structuring your study around these focused intervals, you align your behavior with the brain's natural capacity for attention and learning. Spacing and repetition are essential for long-term learning because the brain strengthens memories more effectively when information is revisited over time rather than absorbed in a single session. When you first learn something, the neural connections representing that information are relatively weak and unstable. Without reinforcement, those connections begin to fade, which is a natural process known as forgetting. While this might seem like a problem, it actually creates an opportunity for deeper learning when the material is revisited. When you return to information after some time has passed, the brain is forced to reconstruct it. This process of reconstruction requires more effort than simply reviewing it immediately after learning. That added effort is what strengthens the neural circuits. Each time you successfully recall or relearn the material, the connections become more robust and easier to access in the future. This is why spaced repetition leads to more durable memory compared to cramming, where information is repeatedly reviewed in a short period without sufficient intervals. The timing of these intervals plays an important role. If you revisit material too soon, the brain does not need to work hard to recall it, and the strengthening effect is limited. If you wait too long, the information may be almost completely forgotten, making it difficult to rebuild. The optimal spacing lies somewhere in between, where recall is challenging but still possible. This balance ensures that the brain is actively engaged in reconstructing the memory, which enhances retention. Spacing also helps prevent interference between similar pieces of information. When you study multiple topics in a single extended session, the brain may struggle to differentiate between them, leading to confusion or blending of details. By separating study sessions over time, you give the brain space to consolidate each set of information more clearly. This improves both accuracy and clarity when recalling what you have learned. Repetition across multiple sessions reinforces the same neural pathways in slightly different contexts. Each time you revisit the material, your brain encodes it with additional cues, such as the environment, your mental state, or the way the information is presented. These multiple layers of encoding make the memory more flexible and easier to access from different angles. This is especially important for applying knowledge in real-world situations, where conditions are rarely identical to how you originally learned the material. Another important aspect is that spaced repetition works best when combined with active recall. Simply rereading information at spaced intervals is less effective than testing yourself or trying to retrieve the material from memory. The combination of spacing and retrieval creates a powerful learning effect because it repeatedly challenges the brain to reconstruct and strengthen the same circuits. Over time, this approach leads to a significant increase in retention and understanding. Information that might have been quickly forgotten after a single session becomes deeply embedded in your memory. The brain becomes more efficient at accessing it, and the effort required for recall decreases, allowing you to build on that knowledge more effectively. Recovery is an essential part of learning because the brain does not only change during periods of active focus, it also reorganizes and strengthens neural circuits during rest. When you engage in intense study, specific patterns of neural activity are generated as you process and encode information. However, these patterns are initially fragile. Without proper recovery, they do not stabilize into long-term memory, and much of what you studied can be lost or remain inaccessible. One of the key processes that occurs during recovery is consolidation. This is when the brain replays and reinforces the neural activity associated with what you learned. This replay can happen during sleep as well as during periods of quiet wakefulness, where you are not actively taking in new information. During these times, the brain strengthens connections between neurons, making the memory more stable and easier to retrieve later. Sleep is particularly important for this process. During different stages of sleep, especially slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, the brain performs distinct functions related to memory. Slow-wave sleep is associated with stabilizing and strengthening newly formed memories, while REM sleep helps integrate those memories into existing networks and extract patterns or meaning. If sleep is insufficient or disrupted, these processes are impaired and the benefits of your study sessions are significantly reduced. Non-sleep deep rest is another valuable tool for recovery. This involves deliberately entering a low stimulation state, such as lying down with your eyes closed and minimizing external input. In this state, the brain can shift into patterns of activity that support consolidation without the need for full sleep. Even short periods of this kind of rest after learning can enhance retention by allowing neural circuits to stabilize before they are overwritten by new information. Recovery also helps reset your ability to focus. Continuous mental effort without breaks leads to cognitive fatigue, where attention becomes harder to sustain and performance declines. By stepping away from the task, you allow neuromodulator levels to return to baseline, which restores your capacity for deep focus in the next session. This cycle of effort and recovery is what allows you to maintain high-quality learning over time rather than experiencing diminishing returns. There is also an important balance between input and consolidation. If you continuously consume new information without giving the brain time to process it, you create interference between different memories. This can make it harder to retain any of them effectively. Incorporating recovery periods ensures that each learning session has time to be encoded properly before new material is introduced. Over time, treating recovery as a deliberate part of your learning process leads to more efficient and durable results. Instead of relying on constant effort, you create a rhythm where focused work is followed by periods that allow the brain to solidify those gains. This makes learning not only more effective, but also more sustainable, as it reduces fatigue and supports LON. When these elements are applied together: focused attention, active retrieval, learning through errors, structured study intervals, spaced repetition, and deliberate recovery, they create a complete system that aligns with how the brain actually learns. Instead of relying on passive exposure or last-minute effort, you build knowledge through repeated, high-quality engagement followed by proper consolidation. Over time, this approach not only improves how much you retain, but also how quickly and effectively you can learn new information, turning studying into a more efficient and sustainable process.